This is WCRN Weekend with your host, Pat Rice.
You are now tuned in to another episode of WCRN Weekends with Pat Rice on AM 830. And today's episode is for all you music lovers and bookworms out there. We live in a world where the media constantly focuses on pop culture, celebrities, and we can now follow celebrities everywhere as they broadcast their lives on social media along with ourselves. Sometimes we ask ourselves, what is it like to be in the shoes of some big-time rock star? And right now on the line with us, we have Boston native, author, and music journalist Joe Milliken, who is releasing a new biography entitled Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars. We're here to talk to Joe about the new release and his background as a writer. Hey Joe, welcome to the show, and how's it going?
Hey, I'm doing good, Pat. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Anytime, Joe. How did you get into writing?
Well, writing goes back. I've been a published writer for about 20 years. And it all started when I went to college. I was an art student. And although I loved art and was pretty good at it, I kind of discovered early on in my college career that I probably wasn't going to be good enough to make it in the art world as I looked around at all my fellow art students who all appeared to be better than me. So I needed to find another creative outlet, and I was taking journalism and creative writing classes in college as well. So my creativity sort of shifted away from the art world into the writing world, and that's how I kind of got into writing. I mostly concentrate on music journalism because music is my passion, but I'm not a player. I'm not a musician. I couldn't carry a tune if it had a handle on it, so I had to find a way to stay involved in music somehow. So I sort of married that with my writing, and that's how I enjoy my passion for music, is by writing about it. So that's how it kind of evolved into me becoming a music journalist.
That's terrific, Joe. And who would you say are some of your favorite authors, writers, or music journalists?
You know, this is going to sound like an odd answer, but I'm going to be honest about it. For as much writing as I do, I'm not much of a reader. I don't know if that's odd or not. I haven't talked to a lot of writers about this particular subject or question that you just asked me. Most of my writing revolves around, I'm also a sports fan, so I do a lot of newspaper reading, and most of my book reading also revolves around music. So I don't particularly concentrate on any specific author to follow. It's more reading about music itself. So I kind of go out there in the bookshelves and look for music-related books and biographies that I think would be interesting to me, and that's how I kind of go after what I read. So it's not really so much who's writing it, it's the subject of music itself that draws me. So I don't know if that's a weird thing or not, that I'm not too much of a reader, even though I write constantly.
That's kind of funny, Joe, because with me being in radio, you think I would listen to the radio all the time, but when I'm not in the studio or doing my job, I'm not really listening to too much radio. I have my aux or iPod plugged in.
Right, that makes sense. So maybe you understand me then in a way.
Yeah, no, definitely. So what is the best way to write? Like free writing down your thoughts and going from there, or putting deep thought into each sentence or paragraph? Do you have any kind of formula?
This is my first book that I've done, and all of my published writing previously has all been magazines and newspapers, which are obviously much shorter pieces to write than, writing out a full biography about somebody. So when I usually write my articles, I start out by doing all the interviews that I can and get as much input as I can from whatever the subject is and whatever people are connected to the subject I'm writing about. And I kind of lay down some bones. I do like a structural type of draft for an article, if you will, and then I usually let that set a little bit, getting down the basic information. Then I go back to the interviews that I did with people and put together the quotes that they give me, and I sort of drop those into the structure of the article after that. And then I usually like to let it set for a day or so and kind of step away from it and let it breathe a little bit, and then I'll go back through it again, see what my perspective is on it, and work on details and tweaking it from there. That more applies to the article writing stuff that I do, but that's kind of the approach I take.
And it's a bit of a process because you write a little bit, you go back, review the work that you did, and then you add quotes or maybe some new information that someone told you about into the story, and you make it all work somehow at the end of the day.
Yeah, it kind of evolves. You start out with something and you get your ideas down, and then, like I said, you add in the quotes from people, and it just kind of develops from there. And actually I kind of took that approach with the book too. The first year or so of working on this book, I didn't really do a lot of interviews. I wanted to gather as much information as I could about Ben and his life, and I started it that way and sort of created a long essay, if you will. And once I learned as much as I could about him on my own, that's when I turned my attention to doing the interviews. Which was a long process for sure. And that's when I started doing interviews, and I decided I was going to interview as many people as I could, because obviously Ben is no longer with us. He couldn't speak for himself, so I had to find as many people that were close to him as possible so they could be his voice. So the process kind of worked out the same way as when I do article writing, as I did with this manuscript. I started with a long essay and just started building from there and adding in quotes as I went along, and it just grew and grew that way.
What made you choose to write about the singer, bassist, and co-founder of the Cars, Benjamin Orr?
Well, it kind of happened by accident, if you will. I have always been a Cars fan. I was in junior high school when the Cars first hit the scene. It was at a time I was in junior high school and I was just starting to get into rock and roll. So they were one of the first bands that ever influenced me. And me being from Boston and them being a Boston band also added to it. I felt like they were my band, from my hometown kind of a thing. So I've always been a fan of the band, but when I was tossing around ideas to write my first book, I will admit that writing about the Cars, and specifically Ben, wouldn't necessarily have been my first choice, even though they are one of my favorite bands. But out of the blue one day, I was contacted by a Cars fan. She saw my profile on social media, saw that I was from Boston, saw that I was a music journalist, saw that I listed the Cars as one of my favorite bands, and she sent me a message out of the blue and said, you should write a book about Ben.
Oh.
So I thought to myself, well, if I was going to write a book about that subject, why wouldn't I just write a book about the band itself and not necessarily an individual member? So I asked that question, and she told me, well, you should look into Ben's life, and I think you'll think differently. So that's what I did. I was curious enough, and I looked into Ben's life a little bit, and I started finding out all of these interesting things about him that I didn't know. He's originally from Cleveland, and he was sort of a childhood star, if you will. He was in one of his earliest bands when he was 17 years old. There was a TV show in Cleveland at the time called Upbeat, and it was kind of like Cleveland's version of American Bandstand, where national artists would come in and do their songs. But the unique part of this show was that they also had a house band that would perform on the TV show, that would kind of sit in the background from these national artists who were appearing on the show. And Upbeat would go out into Cleveland and find local bands to be a part of the show and be the house band. Well, Ben's band was called the Grasshoppers. They were one of the biggest bands in the city at the time. The guy's only 17 years old, and all of a sudden his band becomes the house band for this Upbeat show. So here he is at 17 years old, one of his earliest bands, and he's on a nationally syndicated TV show. So I thought that was pretty amazing, and I went out and asked a couple of friends who were also Cars fans if they knew anything about this, about Ben's background and those types of things, and nobody knew this.
Really?
So that was the hook for me. I said, okay, I'm going to tell this guy's story because it's pretty amazing to me that a 17-year-old kid could be on national TV, and this is, literally 15 years before he ever became famous in the Cars. So it was just this whole other story about his life, and I thought it was really interesting, and that's what made me decide to specifically write about Ben.
That's incredible. I didn't know that either. I know a couple of the classic hits that the Cars make. You can hear their songs constantly on oldie radio stations, especially around here in Boston. Could you tell us a little bit about how Ben came to Boston? And since you were growing up in Boston, did you know of the Cars when they were on their journey up to mainstream success, still performing in Boston at venues?
I didn't know of the Cars until everybody else did, until, you all of a sudden hearing these songs on the radio that sound so unique and different from everybody else, and you think to yourself, who the heck are these guys? But as far as Ben ending up in Boston, well, as I just mentioned, he's a Cleveland native and grew up in Cleveland. Rick Ocasek, the other co-founder of the band, he's originally from the Baltimore area, but when he was young, his father worked for NASA, and his father got transferred to Ohio, and that's how him and his family ended up in the Cleveland area. And he was also obviously into music and was into bands, and Rick and Ben were in different bands, but they started running into each other because they'd play the same venues and go to the same parties and those kinds of things. And they eventually got together, and met each other. There's a couple varying stories about how they first really met and decided to become bandmates, but the one I go with, because I've heard it multiple times and a couple of people I interviewed who knew Ben really well also said it went this way. So they actually ended up just talking together at a party one night, and they ended up in a basement together, and there were some instruments around, and Ben picked up an acoustic guitar and sang a Beatles song to Rick. And Rick is quoted as saying it was the most beautiful voice he had ever heard in his life. And right then and there, they decided that they were going to form a partnership, and they did. And although it took them about a decade of traveling around and getting new bands and new bandmates and all that kind of thing, but at one point when they were still in the Ohio area, Rick decided that he wanted to go to Boston, a college town, a lot of opportunity to do gigs, a very cultural atmosphere. So he decided, I'm leaving Ohio and I'm going to Boston. At the time, Ben wasn't too sure he wanted to do that because, now this is the early 70s now. This is several years before the Cars hit it big. But Ben wasn't sure he wanted to leave the Cleveland area at that point because he had just recently lost his dad. So he was, home with his mom, taking care of her, making sure everything was settled in that regard. So Rick went to Boston, but he kept in touch with Ben, kept calling him up and saying, this is a great place. You got to come to Boston. So eventually Ben, once things settled down on the home front and he knew his mom was okay, he moved to Boston too. And that's how they both ended up in Boston. They found some more bandmates, started up another band, and that's how they eventually launched the Cars out of the Boston area.
And it just blew up from there. Do you know what was one of the first labels that they signed to?
I mean, the only label that they were ever associated with was Elektra Records.
Really? That's
yes,
pretty good.
When they formed, they had already been, especially Rick and Ben, had already been traveling all over the country, one of those starving artist kind of things. They were barely surviving, doing as many gigs as they could. When they eventually settled on the members of the band that would become the Cars, something clicked, and they knew that this was the formula they needed to make it. And they told themselves, okay, this is our band. They changed their name to the Cars, and they made a pact and said, we are going to have a record deal within 1 year, and we're going to do everything we can to make that happen. If we don't get a record deal, we'll make the record on our own. So they sort of made that pact with themselves and just started gigging nonstop, taking any gig they could get, and sure enough, within a year, they were signed to Elektra Records, and that was their label for the entirety of the band.
That's really interesting because nowadays artists really jump from label to label. There's only a few musicians and bands out there that have truly stuck to one label throughout their whole career. Is there any backstory behind why the band called themselves the Cars?
Well, they had a couple of different names that they used. The last name of their band before they turned it into the Cars was a band called Cat and Swing. And there were elements of the Cars sound in that band, but Cat and Swing was more of a jazzy kind of Steely Dan feel to it. The sound that would eventually be the Cars was starting to morph into that, but the Cat and Swing band was, like I said, still a little on the jazzier side. And Rick is more of a minimalist kind of guy. He's like a Velvet Underground kind of sounding band. Those are the types of things that he likes to listen to. And the Cat and Swing was too jazzy for him and too complicated, so they switched out a couple members, brought in a couple new members. Ben was just the front man when they were Cat and Swing. He switched the bass when they launched the Cars. And David Robinson, the drummer, was in a couple of Boston bands at the time. When they brought him into the fold, David said, okay, we need to change our image, we need to change the band name. And he had a name that he always wanted to use for a band, but every band that he was in previously, he would join a band that already had a name. So he kept the name in the back of his mind for just the right time, and when these guys formed, he came out and said it. I've got a name for a band that I've always wanted to use, and it's the Cars. And obviously they all loved it, and that's how the name was born.
And they pedaled to the metal, and they made it all the way to the top with some great hits like Let the Good Times Roll, Let's Go. Why did you specifically decide to reference the song Let's Go within your book title? How or why does that song represent the Cars or in a certain light?
Good question. When I was writing this book, I didn't have the title picked out right off the bat. I had a bunch of different ideas that I was mulling about, and as Cars fans through social media were finding out that I was writing this book, were getting in touch with me, so I was getting suggestions from fans, and I had a list of different ideas. I ended up calling it Let's Go because when I discovered the band and their first two iconic albums, the debut self-titled album and then Candy-O, Let's Go was my favorite Cars song when I was young. I can remember going to the local pizza place and the song was on the jukebox and I'd pour quarters into the jukebox and play that song over and over again. So not only was it one of my favorite Cars songs, but to me it also fits Ben's personality in that I interviewed a lot of people over the years who knew him well, and Ben was a go-getter. He was the type of person that he never sat still. He was always doing something creative. He always wanted to be out and doing something. He was always, and like when the Cars were in their heyday, the other guys in the band weren't necessarily like that. Some of them liked to sort of stay to themselves, whereas Ben liked to get out on the town and see what's going on. So I always have this vision of Ben, after a gig saying, let's go. Let's get out there and see what's going on. So it just seemed like it fit Ben's personality to me, along with it, of course, being such an iconic rock song in itself.
Absolutely. And that's perfect, because I was going to ask next, when you were putting together this biography, what were some things that you learned about Ben? Like, did he lead a party lifestyle? I read that he was considered the heartthrob of the group. As we all know, later in his life, he sadly passed away due to pancreatic cancer in 2000. Do we know if his lifestyle played a role in the disease, or how did Ben live his life on a daily basis?
I'm not really positive if his lifestyle necessarily contributed to his illness, but I will tell you that I don't know if I'd call him a partier per se, but he liked to meet people. He liked to get out there and do things. He wasn't a sit around in a hotel room and do nothing kind of guy. He was creative and always wanted to be on the go and meeting people. So that was kind of his personality. But I also want to say that a very unique aspect about this man was that he almost had a split personality. And what I mean is he sort of flipped the switch when he went on stage and became Benjamin Orr, the heartthrob rock star of the band. But when he came off stage, he was a totally different person. He would flip that switch off, and he was just a normal guy. He wasn't looking for attention. He wouldn't, dress to the nines and go out looking for attention and to have fans, gathering all around him and things of that nature. He was a reserved kind of guy, and he was a very private man off stage. So he was a very unique individual, and I think there was a certain amount of mystery to him. Even though he was a go-getter and liked to get out there and meet people, he was also a very private guy and didn't look for the limelight. Really led a very normal life when he was off the stage. He had a very unique personality in that way.
That's interesting, because that's hard to find in a lot of celebrities and stars nowadays. Like you said, they get dressed for the nines. They're wearing bling or jewelry like a lot of the hip-hop R&B guys today. What's your number one favorite story about Ben that you write in your book, Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars?
Oh, wow. That is a tough one, to pick a specific story, because I got to tell you, I did this book over time. It took me about a decade to get this thing written. I've worked on it for about 11 years in my spare time, and I interviewed well over 100 people who knew Ben. Obviously, I couldn't interview the man himself, so I had to interview all these other people who knew him and to have other people speak for him. So to come up with a specific story might be a little difficult. I'd have to really think about that to provide an answer for you. But I do want to say, or I will say, that one common thread about Ben that I've learned from all these people that I interviewed was he was a very loyal guy, and he never forgot his friends. One of the things I enjoy telling people, or want people to know about Ben, is that after the band became famous, he proved his loyalty in that when the Cars were ready to go on tour and there were dates set for the Cleveland area, his hometown, he would actually get a hold of his friends that he grew up with. He had a close circle of friends in the Cleveland area, especially old bandmates of his that were in bands with him when they were young. And he used to get a hold of them and say, hey, we're coming into town to do a show, and I'm going to be here on this date, so get ready. And when the time came and the band got into town, he would get a hold of his friends, and he would get them tickets for the show, get them backstage passes, have limos go pick them up, bring them to the show and bring them home, get them T-shirts and stuff. And he used to make it a night on the town for all of his friends. He was a very loyal guy. So that's something I always like to emphasize, that as world famous as the man became, he never forgot his roots. He never forgot where he came from. And I find that a very endearing quality in a man that could have been the opposite of that. You know, he could have been world famous and not ever thought about anybody again.
Oh, yeah.
As far as people that he knew, you know, in his formative years. But he was the opposite of that. He always remembered where he came from. He was very proud of his hometown and the heritage of it.
Absolutely. Sounds like he was a very humble guy for all the celebrity status that he had and talent.
Oh, absolutely, he was humble. I heard it over and over and over again from all these people I interviewed. He was very generous. Here's a quick story without revealing too much because, you know, you got to keep some secrets before the book comes out.
Definitely.
But when Ben passed away, his memorial service was held at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because it was his hometown, and that's where it was. A couple of his band members were at the memorial service, and the man I mentioned earlier, David Robinson, was there. And David told me a story about how when he was at that memorial service, through all of Ben's friends who would approach him and talk to him that day, he told me he learned more about Ben in that one day than in the whole time he was his bandmate, because Ben was very quiet and very reserved, didn't want to talk a lot about himself. He wasn't a bragging kind of guy. He was very quiet and to himself. And David told me a story about how all these people kept coming up to him at this memorial service who all just loved and adored Ben, and they all had their own little Ben stories for him about how Ben helped them. You know, if they were down and out and needed money or just needed help with something, that Ben would help all these people. He was so generous and so kind to all these friends and family members that he grew up with. And I can remember talking to David Robinson on the phone and him just saying it was just wave after wave of people coming up to him. And even though they were sad that they were losing Ben, they were also incredibly happy to tell their own personal stories about Ben. And David told me that even though he knew Ben was a generous and loyal guy, he really had no idea of the impact that he had on so many people. And to have this drummer say to me, I learned more about Ben in that one day and then in the whole time I knew him as a bandmate, that was pretty amazing to hear. For sure.
That's wonderful, you know, to finally be able to hear a story about a rock and roll legend that is humble, because, you know, a lot of these rock stars, you hear stories about them falling into like drug addiction, gambling their money away, are not the nicest stories, you know?
Absolutely.
And so to hear a guy that seems so humble and so true and real to his people and giving back to his community is just great to hear. And it makes you respect the band and Ben himself even a little bit more. Joe, for people who want to pick up your book, where can they go find it?
The book is not officially released yet. It's due on November 11th. And to tell you a little quick anecdote about that, November 11th, which is 11/11 date-wise, Ben's real name is Orzechowski. He has a Polish background. When he was young, people had trouble remembering his name, pronouncing his name, spelling his name, so they called him Benny 11 Letters. So my book is coming out on 11/11 in honor of Benny 11 Letters.
You can't get any better than that.
Yeah, it's my public relations coordinator Donna and I kind of came up with that idea, and we asked the publisher if they could make the release date that specific date, and they were happy to do that for us. So anyway, with that little story said, the book is due on November 11th, but it can be pre-ordered now. My publisher is Roman and Littlefield. You can pre-order the book at the publisher's website. Donna and I also created a website specifically for the book, and it's real simple, benorbook.com. So you can also go there and pre-order the book as well. It's also available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, so you can order the book now.
Wonderful. And are you doing any local book signings that people can come by and say hi? And if people want to contact you to cover their musical ventures and look more into your work, where can they also visit?
Yeah, we're actually got all that in the works right now. Donna and I are trying to work out a couple of different dates where I'm going to do some book signings. Because I, have another job and a family and those types of things, I'm not able to, just go on a book tour and travel around the country for a couple of months. I wish I could. That sounds like a wonderful thing. So I have to be sort of select about my book launching dates. I want my initial book launching to be in Ben's hometown, so I plan on doing one in Cleveland. I also plan on doing one in Boston, of course. It's my hometown, plus it's the hometown of the Cars and where they launched. I also plan on doing one here in Vermont where I live. So those three are definitely going to happen. The dates aren't solidified. We're still got it in the works, but people can go to the website, benorbook.com. There'll be information there. Also, I have a page for the book on social media, on Facebook. We're also on Twitter, so we always update those social media avenues as well. People can go to those locations to get updates on when the official dates will be released for the book launching. People can always send us an email at benorbook@gmail.com. So that's another way that people can contact us to ask us any questions they have.
Awesome. And Joe, any advice for inspiring writers or music journalists?
Well, I'd like to say that, and this can apply to anything that anybody wants to do or aspires to do, don't give up on your dreams. When I became a writer, I never thought that I would be an editor. I never thought that my articles could be in newspapers and magazines, and I accomplished that. When I started this book project, I thought to myself, will I ever be able to get a publisher? It's hard to have confidence in that when you've never done it before. So I had it in my head for the longest time that I was going to have to self-publish this book, or I was planning to self-publish the book if I never found a publisher. Well, I started contacting publishers, and I had heard stories about authors taking years to find a traditional publisher to take their book. And in some cases, I've talked to fledgling authors that have never found a book deal. So I am honored and feel very lucky in saying that when I started contacting publishers about my book idea, literally within a few weeks, a publisher agreed to take me on board. I didn't have the confidence in knowing that this could all happen for me, and I want to tell everybody that if it can happen for me, it can happen for anybody. You just can't give up, and you have to follow your dreams, and you have to stick to it. Just like Ben and Rick did. They traveled the country and starved for a decade before the Cars, made it big, and I'm sure many times they thought about giving up their dream, but they never did, and it happened for them. So I can attest to that. If you have a goal and you have a dream, don't ever give up until it happens.
That's excellent advice, Joe. Hey, once again, I want to thank you for coming on to my show to talk about your upcoming biography, Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars, which is being released this November 11th. You can pre-order the book at benorbook.com. You can also pre-order it at Barnes & Nobles along with Amazon and many other outlets. We have been speaking with Joe Milliken, and this has been another episode of WCRN Weekends with Pat Rice on AM 830.
This has been WCRN Weekend and your host, Pat Rice.